The file begins. November 14th, 2025. The date is etched, a date that promised a new chapter in the chronicles of Americana, instead delivered an obituary. Todd Snider, the bard of the downtrodden, the jester of forgotten truths, was gone. 59 years. A life lived on the fringes, now extinguished by pneumonia. A clinical diagnosis. A phrase designed to bring closure. It brought only questions. The music world paused, then erupted in a cacophony of disbelief. Tributes poured like cheap whiskey. But behind the eulogies, a whisper began. A dissonant chord. This was not merely the quiet exit of a troubadour. This was the final, brutal cut in a life already scarred by self-inflicted wounds and predatory shadows. His last album, Lonesome And Then Some, had just begun its slow descent into the charts. A final, desperate cry into the void. A cruel irony that the very air he chronicled, the very breath of his stories, would ultimately betray him. The official narrative painted a picture of a man succumbing to illness, alone. A simple end. We know better. The truth, like cheap gold, often hides beneath layers of polished lies. This pneumonia, it was merely the final nail. The coffin was already built. The official cause of death, a whisper of pneumonia, felt thin, too thin, like old paper. The public, fed on carefully curated narratives, struggled to reconcile the image of a beloved storyteller with the abruptness of his final act. But the whispers had roots. They spoke of Salt Lake City. Pause October 31st, a date now stained. Halloween night, not of costumes but of blood. Reports surfaced, an alleged violent assault outside a hotel. A man beaten, robbed, staples in his head. The kind of detail that sticks. The kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into a narrative of quiet illness. Then, the indignity. Hospitalization, an arrest, disorderly conduct, criminal trespass, threats of violence, a public spectacle. The image of the artist reduced to a common criminal, struggling against unseen forces within a sterile hospital ward. The conflicting reports that followed, a fog of obfuscation. Convenient, too convenient. These were not mere incidents. These were the jagged edges of a deeper truth. The industry, a gilded cage, often exacts a price beyond royalties. Snider, it seemed, was collecting his bill. The initial reports, fragmented, contradictory, were not just news. They were clues. Fragments of a larger, uglier tapestry. A tapestry woven with threads of desperation, betrayal, and the cold, hard concrete of consequences. The hunt for the truth began here, in the wreckage of his last tour, in the shadow of a public humiliation that preceded his final, lonely breath. This was not a simple biography. This was an inventory of sins. The inventory, however, demands a deeper excavation. Before the concrete of Nashville, before the gilded cages, and the final public indignity, there was a genesis. A small town, Portland, Oregon, a place of perpetual rain and nascent dreams. Here a boy learned the language of observation, the quiet poetry of the overlooked. He absorbed the dust of wanderers, the grit of forgotten tales. A restless spirit already forming. The guitar became an extension of that spirit, a blunt instrument for carving truth from the mundane. He didn't just learn chords, he learned to listen to the whispers of the world, transforming them into narratives both bitter and beautiful. This was the foundation, the raw, unpolished talent, a promise of something both brilliant and inherently fragile, a structure built on quicksand perhaps. The road beckoned, a siren's call wrapped in cheap motel sheets and the promise of open mics. Nashville, the gilded cage, awaited. He arrived, a drifter with a guitar and a head full of observations. The early stages were a grind. Small, smoky clubs, faces in the dark. But his voice, a gravelly truth, cut through the din. His songs, sharp as broken glass, yet possessing a strange comforting melody, began to resonate. This was his signature, a storyteller with a cynical grin and a heart that bled for the forgotten. He crafted tales of ordinary lives, extraordinary failures, and the absurdities of existence. The industry, ever hungry, took notice. Deals were signed, album covers materialized. The allure of artistic freedom, the open road stretching endlessly before him, felt like salvation. The applause, the bright lights, the growing crowds, they were intoxicating, a dizzying ascent. But beneath the veneer of success, the machinery of fame had already begun its slow, inexorable work. The concrete hardened around him. The price, as always, remained unseen. Pause until later. The road led him to the monumental doors of the studios, where promises sang sweeter than any melody. But beneath the gilding, the anatomy of a fall lay hidden, encased in fine print. The first contracts, gleaming with a false sheen, were, in essence, a digital coffin, slowly hammered shut. Signatures penned with a tremor surrendered a piece of soul, a sliver of voice, a fragment of future. This wasn't a deal. It was an exile from his own creative freedom, masked as a ladder to fame. Every chord, every lyric, every record sold, mere percentages, melting into the pockets of unseen puppeteers. He sang of freedom, but his chains were forged of gold. This is not a complaint. It's an inventory of the sins of a system that feasts on talent, leaving only scorched earth. Pause, or the rubble of an empire he never quite finished building. The wreckage of an empire which he never finished building, because the empire, in essence, wasn't built for him. Behind the scenes, in the shadow of the bunker of recording studios, threads were woven, controlling his destiny. Unspoken demands, schedules, laid out to the millisecond. A continuous run to catch the train that he himself had accelerated. A back broken not only by age, but by endless flights, lack of sleep, the weight of expectations. This was not a creative process. This was the meat grinder of fame, where each album was a new piece of meat thrown into the millstones. His music, his legacy, was turning into a bitter testament written by fatigue. The fatal mistake was the belief that talent could defeat the system. The system merely digested him. Pause. It was a sentence passed long before the final note. His fall, which began long before, reached its peak on the cold slabs of a foreign city, Salt Lake City, October 31st, 2025. A night that was supposed to be just another entry on the tour schedule turned into an inky stain on his already ravaged biography. The official version, circulated through channels, spoke of a brutal attack, a robbery, a head requiring surgical intervention. This was the story the world was ready to swallow, a story of a victim. But behind the scenes, in the shadows of police reports and internal investigations, other contours emerged, less heroic, more murky. Pause. Police protocols, which later became part of our posthumous audit, offered a different anatomy of the fall. Not a blow from an outsider's hand, but his own inertia. Not an attack by robbers, but a collision with reality, blurred by alcohol. Internal documents, marked __, quote, _0 __ indicated that the head injuries, particularly the one requiring staples, could have been the result of a fall on his own tour bus. The drink, meant to numb the pain, only pushed him to the edge of the abyss. This was not a tragedy orchestrated by external forces. It was an inevitable consequence, a bitter testament to self-destruction, disguised as an attack. The system that couldn't break him allowed him to break himself. And then, as always, it chewed him up and spat out his remains. Suddenly, deep, gravelly voice laced with weariness and a hint of menace. That evening, as Halloween shadows deepened over Salt Lake City, Todd Snider, whose back already bore the weight of a 3-year hiatus, was scheduled to perform. Instead, according to initial reports, he found himself on the street, a victim of violence. Blows, pain, and blood soaking into the cold concrete. He was taken to Holy Cross Hospital, where medics stitched the wound on his head. But peace was short-lived. Within the walls of that same hospital, where a shattered destiny demanded healing, a new sentence was passed upon him. Slightly longer pause, a breath-catching. Arrest, charges of public intoxication, trespassing, and making threats. Witness accounts were contradictory, words tangled, but the fact remained: the man who had just allegedly been beaten and robbed was now in custody himself. The police report, compiled later, offered its own version. Not a street fight, but internal chaos. A fall aboard his own bus, possibly brought on by a state of inebriation. That was the final chord of his tour. The tour, barely begun after a long absence, was canceled on November 3rd, banished from the schedule. His return home to Nashville was not a respite, but merely a change of scenery for the next act of the drama. Breathing was difficult. A hospital room in Hendersonville. The diagnosis: undiagnosed pneumonia. The meat grinder of fame continued to churn, grinding his body, his spirit. And on November 14th, 2025, at the age of 59, he took his last breath, leaving behind only the wreckage of an empire built on words and music. His return home to Nashville was not a respite, but merely a change of scenery for the next act of the drama. Breathing became difficult. A hospital room in Hendersonville. The diagnosis: undiagnosed pneumonia. The meat grinder of fame continued to turn, grinding his body, his spirit. And on the 14th of November, 2025, at the age of 59, he took his last breath, leaving behind only the wreckage of an empire built on words and music. This was not just an illness, it was a culmination. Years of roads, dust, and solitude. Every hotel room, every stage backdrop, every glass, a brick in the wall of his isolation. The incident in Salt Lake City, with its confused versions and public humiliation, was just the final brushstroke on the canvas of complete oblivion. A man capable of weaving golden threads from words found himself caught in the web of his own helplessness. His personal life, his squalor, became public domain, contrasting with the honed diamond cut of his artistry. Death from pneumonia, a quiet, meek end. No crowds of fans, no camera flashes, only the cold silence of the hospital room, where a talent that once shone brighter than the sun faded like a dying candle. This was not a tragedy, but an inevitable finale, written into his scarred destiny long before he picked up his first guitar. Yes, somber, gravelly voice, slow pacing, with pauses for dramatic effect. Void. That's what remained after Snider. Not just a physical absence, but a gaping hole in the landscape where once stood a beacon of caustic wisdom. The posthumous audit of his life reveals not a sudden collapse, but the anatomy of a fall, stretched over decades. What is the true price of a life given to art? For Snider, it was a payment measured not just in applause, but in broken connections, in undermined health, in public humiliations that he seemed to attract like a magnet. The music industry, that ruthless machine, demanded constant output, offering no protection, no true support in return. It squeezed you dry, then discarded you when the resource was exhausted. The fragility of fame. Today you're on top, tomorrow, just a line in a police report, the subject of tabloid gossip. His legacy, his bitter testament, now consists not only of songs, it is also a warning. That talent is not armor, that even billions cannot buy salvation from oneself. And the debris of his empire, these rhymes and melodies, only underscore the tragic verdict. He was too great for this world, or this world was too small for him. The irony of fate, when he left, the industry that perhaps contributed to his downfall immediately rushed to organize tributes. Todd Snider rules. Tribute, an echo of applause that came too late. And the project All My Songs, his posthumous releases, now sound like voices from a digital coffin, a last desperate desire to be heard, to be understood. Even after death, he continues to speak. But who is listening? And what will we, the observers, take away from this story? Beyond a pleasant melancholy, only a cold, concrete fact remains. Behind every gleam of gold lies dirt, and behind every great song, the shadow of a bunker where the artist fought and lost the battle with himself.